All right, welcome everybody. I am Paddo, and with me is Umbrella in Atlanta, and we're going to be breaking down patch 0.24 up in this mother. Okay, I'm not going to go that far. I'm not going to steal his flavor, but let's hop into the new goodness of this patch. We have 5 brand new cards. We have Ma, this little cutie down here, is a 1-cost 3/1. Ethermaster is going to let you replace more cards. Paddocast, the Realm Keeper, is going to be your best friend, or maybe he's going to heal up, maybe he's going to damage. You never know. The High Hand. Possible new big guy coming in the neutrals, and then Rook, and look at that awesome pixel art for him. Big frenzy dude. And I'm just gonna kick it off, send this right over to Umbrella. Umbrella, what card out of these has you most excited with this patch?
I feel like it's secretly obvious. I really think Ma is super adorable. So it's not, it's 3/1. Okay, it's a 3/1, which is also really cool because 3/1 really helps push the aggressive agenda. 3/1 being that extra spike of damage you can push through for a little bit more. So I think I actually like Ma because it's really cute, but it does a lot of really cool things as well. I would say, I think all of these cards are interesting, and I think I know which one Atlanta likes, so I'm gonna save that one because I also think it's cool. I think Rook's effect is awesome in just the ability to catch your opponent off guard, throw a Rook down, or just have a Rook and Rook is hard to position against in that it'll tear through your board and leave a huge guy behind as well. Especially Rook on a Vindicator can just show up, destroy your board, have a giant person. It'd be a lot of fun.
Yeah, definitely some big oomph. So Atlanta, pass it over to you. We think we know who you're gonna choose, but what card really has you excited in this patch?
So I really like Ethermaster.
No way.
Hey, I thought you guys thought High Hand, but Ethermaster is fantastic for, I would suppose, more of controlled style decks, since its stat line doesn't really lend itself that well to aggro, but it kind of gets you closer to a state of card selection where you're basically able to make your deck consistent enough so that it's almost as though you are selecting which cards from your deck that you can play on any given turn. And since Ethermaster seems like it might stack with itself, it would be really cool if you had a lot of them in play and you could replace a lot of cards in one turn, and you would essentially shuffle through your deck, find what you want, and then use it. But for the cost of 2 mana and on a very weak creature, it's definitely a deck building cost because it doesn't push your board very hard. And so overall, really happy to see a card like this in the game. I think that it opens up consistent options for classes or control classes that don't have as great of card draw, like Magmar and Lionar. And it's an Arcanist, so Arcanist Lionar gets a little bit stronger with this, I would say. Plus its health is really good for Divine Bond, and it would probably do really well with Owl Beast. And I would like to see it maybe in Vanar, since it's a little tanky. It's a guy that can be activated, and it also works well with Arcanist, which I think Arcanist Vanar is really interesting. And I would like to see this card get played in a lot of different decks, and I'd like to see what people can do with it.
Yeah. So what about the last guys left on the board? What are your guys' thoughts on Paddocast and also the High Hand? Are these cards that you're gonna see in any specific types of decks?
Well, I think that Paddocast is kind of interesting in that whenever it deals damage, meaning if it were to frenzy, it would most likely trigger this effect as well. So it could be pretty good in a Magmar deck. And if it was buffed at all, where Magmar is very good at buffing their units, another thing that Paddocast would be really good with. And Lionar also fairly similar in that they can buff the card to make it more survivable, maybe make it magic immune or give it extra health. And I also think it'd be pretty good in Vitruvian since they're lacking options for health gain, and Paddocast could potentially give them some health gain. Other than that, Songhai, pretty good there too, since you could inner focus it to activate the effect a few times. And I think it would also be fairly interesting in Vanar, since you could use it to to deal damage with something like Unstoppable and keep it alive for longer, or use a Hearth Sister to swap it in to deal extra damage. I'm a big fan of the Hearth Sister swap in as opposed to the Hearth Sister swap your opponent's creature and hit it, because that's like 90% of how I see Hearth Sister being used, but I like it as like the extendo punch, and I think that Purgatos is a great extendo punch unit.
Yeah, more of as a juxtaposition play instead of just like kind of like bring him over and just hit him with your general kind of play.
Yeah.
So it seems pretty good. So definitely a lot of excitement there with the new cards coming in. But moving over to card changes this patch, we have a few. So Lionar actually gets 2 changes. Beam Shock can now stun enemy generals, and Circle of Life actually becoming basically the healing version of old Spiral Technique. Cost gets lowered to 5. Now it deals 5 damage to an enemy minion and restores 5 health to your general. Umbrella, what do you think these cards do for Lionar? Do you expect these cards to now see play?
I think Beam Shock, this is a nice bump up to Beam Shock. I think the thing with Beam Shock is that it's like stunning something you can always play around it. You can always open up good board positions with it. But the real cost of Beam Shock is always playing the card. Like it costs 0, so you lose a card from your hand. And so I think Beam Shock is interesting with stunning generals because it suddenly picks up this like really strong ability to do 2 things, I think. One is just like start the game, Beam Shock your opponent. You pretty much should be able to contest all the mana tiles. If you're running like an aggressive curve or a mid-range curve, you're going to pretty much have free reign over hitting what you want to play your creatures. It's not likely, like they might have to use a trick like Wraithling Spawn down the middle to try and just like defend their own mana tile. And I think that's the really cool part about it. But it's also interesting that in exactly that aggressive deck, losing a card is really going to hurt you. So I think it's good, but not great in like the aggressive deck. The other thing it does that we saw with the change to Stormblade is getting your Lionar to run them down. And I feel like a well-timed Beam Shock, if you have like a Lionar Ball of Destruction, and you're like, if I could just get over there, I can hold them in place and the game's over. Potentially, you can have units 2 turns away from your opponent and then Beam Shock them and then be able to move into them. Or like in some matchups, if you play like a Sunriser and then Beam Shock your opponent, it's sort of like a really slow inner focus in that your opponent is like, oh god, it's suddenly like active in the sense that it will come hit me next turn. So I think it's a nice push to Beam Shock. Circle of Life, it looks like to some extent it looks like Circle of Life got a little bit weaker, but I don't think the damage and health, like I think 5 damage to a minion is a pretty healthy number. I don't think there's a ton of things that are really like even the things this no longer is clearing out are things that you should probably be able to clear out with like a general hit. So I don't think losing the damage is too substantial. I don't think losing the 1 life is too substantial. I think 5 is a really interesting cost for it because on the 5 core play, it's going to be competing with, I think, there's probably, like there will be scenarios where you play Circle of Life, but there are a lot of times where you'll have a better turn 5 play. So in terms of being on core, I don't know that 5 is much stronger than 6, but if you're playing Circle of Life, since it's that slower effect and you like playing it doesn't get you anywhere near winning, it just helps stabilize the board and stay alive. I think Circle of Life at 5 feels a lot better when you're at higher values of core. So like when you're at 9, this is like Circle of Life and you have 4 core instead of 3 at 6. And I think later on, you're going to see that at higher numbers of core, Circle of Life is going to do a lot more for you than it used to.
Yeah, definitely some interesting changes, and I hope to see these cards a lot more as we go forward. Moving on to the other changes that we had this patch, we have Bone Swarm, now going to lose its cantrip ability. You're going to deal 2 damage to enemy general and all nearby enemy minions. Nether Summoning gets a little tweak here, cost lowered to 4, summon 2 random non-token minions that were killed this game, and then Stormkage getting a tweak here as well, stats changed to a 5/10, and text changed to whenever one of your spells deals damage, put a Kage Lightning into your hand. Atlanta, are these cards going to be seen basically now? I mean, Stormkage was a card that kind of got phased out, Bone Swarm, a card that you would see every now and then and was used more for its draw than anything else, kind of to ping off artifacts. And Nether Summoning, really an RNG card that people were kind of staying away from. Do now these cards actually see play?
So I'll start with Stormkage because I feel like it's probably closer to what it should be as far as archetypically, where now it has a spell focused gameplay mechanic, but I feel that its mana cost sort of like gates it too much in playability within Songhai, because Songhai doesn't really want a 7 mana creature in any of its decks. It would be most viable in the kind of Arcanist late gamey Songhai deck, but at the same time, I don't think that the late gamey Songhai deck can afford to take 7 mana worth of a tempo hit and also have a card that they need to constantly replace until that time comes that they can just plop down. In certain matchups, it could be really good because of the difficulty in which most classes would have to remove it. So for instance, Magmar doesn't really have that great of a way to remove it. They would have to use Metamorphosis, or in some cases Eggmorph might work, but you can play it pretty far away from the Magmar in most cases if you're spacing out correctly. However, it does relatively little when they're already in your face, and that's what I feel might need to be looked at with Stormkage, is that it's a bit costly. I like the effect. I think that it's really good against heavy control, like super heavy control, where you can have a very strong value unit that can potentially kill you or like deal a lot of damage to your opponent with things like Mask or Four Winds Magi, and those are the cards that I think would work best with it, as well as your damage dealing spells. However, I'll take another sort of caveat with this, is that there are only 4 spells in Songhai that deal damage to begin with, which, if you have 3 copies of each, means that roughly a third, or roughly between a third and a fourth of your deck is going to be spells that can actually activate off of Stormkage, and you had to have not used them prior to Stormkage as well. So that could somewhat limit the usage as well. Kind of an 8 gates problem too. So back, I guess, to Bone Swarm. I think that Bone Swarm was a little bit on the low end of usability before with Vitruvian, and removing the cantrip was probably necessary, and that they had way too many cantrips, and so they were just consistently at 6 cards. And this kind of pushes that power level more towards Bone Swarm being usable as just an AoE spell that Vitruvian would want to use. But I also feel that Bone Swarm is very conditional, and it's also a very simple condition to play around. Maybe not in the early phases of the game, but also in the early phases of the game, you're playing creatures with 3 health, which largely unimportant whether you deal 1 or 2 damage to it, because the other damage source is likely to be your general or another 2 damage unit. So I don't really see the Bone Swarm threshold push to 2 damage as being a very major change, considering that the things that die to Bone Swarm are typically not changed, in that they still would die to Bone Swarm. And most of the 2 health units aren't very good for that cost, so it would be harder to... Well, actually, okay. So it can kill Ephemeral Shroud as well, so maybe that's sort of a strong consideration, being that Ephemeral Shroud is one of the few useful 2 HP units for 2. And also Repulsor Beast can be killed. So it does kill off some sort of utility basics, but I also feel like that isn't necessarily enough for Bone Swarm, but we'll have to see. And for Nether Summoning, I feel like this is a step in the right direction. It fits in a bit more now with the Arcanist style, since you would have then a chance to revive Arcanist, which could be really valuable, and also at a reduced cost, or to generate more Nether Summonings, things like that. That could be a very interesting deck archetype, and also works well in the sort of late gamey, put out really big creatures using Darkfire Sacrifice. That could also be good, since you could Darkfire Sacrifice Wraithlings and they don't count towards it. Makes it really nice to kind of curve into a very strong Nether Summoning. And the same thing with some of their other strong mid and late game creatures like Shadow Dancer could be revived by it, and that changes the flow of the game significantly. So I think that Never Summoning will be pretty good, but RNG makes it probably not necessarily top tier.
Yeah, pretty good evaluation. So, I mean, some exciting cards definitely coming out of this patch. Some interesting changes, some cards that weren't getting some good love. All looking great. Upcoming, though, we did actually cancel last week's Duelyst Community Throwdown, but it's going to be coming back this week. This week, we actually have some new stipulations. People, most of the players at large, the drop rates were kind of changed, so people don't quite have the same powerful decks they used to, are a little gun shy. This week, we're actually just going to floor that. Now in the new format is basically going to be common cards or basic cards. That's all you can build your deck out of. So anyone that's hiding out there that hasn't felt like they had a good enough deck to jump up, now is the new time. Everybody's going to basically have the common cards. They're easy to craft. The basic cards should be at your disposal. Make the best deck you can, and may the best Duelyst player win. Are you guys interested in this tournament? Are you going to participate, Atlanta?
Yeah, I'll play it. Not sure what kind of deck I'll take, since I could probably take in any deck with basics and commons only. I can actually play any deck instead of just Songhai for this particular reset. So, yeah, I'll definitely play in it. I think it'll be a lot of fun, and I'd like to see like some of the budget decks that people come up with, and I think that it's a nice direction for tournaments at the moment while the acquisition rates are lower, and we don't have so many kind of like pay-to-win type decks that are out there right now. So I think it'll be a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, and with that, that's going to be a wrap for patch 0.24. Thanks to Umbrella and Atlanta for joining me as always, and catch us next week.